Okay, what do you think? Should we start? Yeah, okay. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to this first ever Cape Artists in Dialogue event. And I'd like to thank you all very much for making the time for this and being part of the conversation. We want to make sure to have some time to talk in a large group format later and use the chat box in an ongoing way as you feel, if you have any responses, and we'll get back to the chat box when we open up the conversation a bit. Um, here, I'm gonna have my notes here a little bit here. I'm Joseph Spilberg. I'm the Associate Director of Education at CAPE. I oversee all of our community programs as well as our research. Why are we having this event? CAPE normally has year-end exhibitions of student artwork from our teacher-artist partnership program across the city. And at those exhibitions, we usually have panel discussions and workshops that are open to the public. This year, we did not have those exhibits, obviously, but this is something that we like to do and bring in different audiences from the educational and arts world. So this is not completely out of the ordinary, but this is part of a larger effort at CAPE to really expand what we do in the public sphere outside of our programs. And we're hoping to continue to do more events like this in the future. Specifically, we'll be having another Artists in Dialogue event in the coming weeks. So look for those postings about that. And the next one will feature Mark Fisher and Nicholas Wiley. So we're really excited about continuing these conversations going on throughout the summer and maybe into the fall. And also, we're really working towards the eventual opening up of a public gallery that would be year-round for student artwork. This is something that's been in the works for years at CAPE. And we're excited that, though it's not set yet where that is and when that would be open, that is something on the horizon. So we hope to have more public events in a new home for year-round student exhibition of arts integrated teaching and learning and student artwork. Lastly, why we want to do this is because at CAPE we're really interested in learning through dialogue. This is a real important component of our work. We feel that this is a form of artistic research in itself. And we feel that as CAPE teachers, teaching artists, students, CAPE staff, we're all artist researchers. And so we feel like this kind of dialogue is really part of our practice. And we're so excited that everyone came here today to be a part of this going forward. So without further ado, I want to introduce our dialoguers today. I'm just going to read their bios out loud. So here's first I'll read William Estrada. He's going to present first, and William's art and teaching is a collaborative discourse of existing images, text, and politics that appoints the audience to critically re-examine public and private spaces. As a teacher, artist, and cultural worker, he reports, records, reveals, and amplifies experiences you find in academic books, school halls, teacher lounges, kitchen tables, barrios, college campuses, and in the conversations of close friends to engage in radical imagination. William has presented in various panels regarding community programming, arts integration, and social justice curricula through the IAEA, the School of Art Institute in Chicago, Illinois Humanities Council, Smart Museum of Arts, the National Guild of School and Arts, National Arts Association, Education Association, Teacher for Social Justice, San Francisco. I'll leave it there. In 2016, he was awarded the Teaching Artist Community Award from 3 Arts. And his current research is focused on developing community-based and culturally relevant projects that center power structures of race, economy, and cultural access in contested spaces. After William presents, Patricia Nguyen will present, and Patricia understands deeply how memory of state violence is inherited and has committed her life's work to cultivating spaces for healing and political empowerment. Versed in public policy, political philosophy, and the performing arts, she has used art to navigate across political barriers. In 2010, she received a Fulbright Fellowship to work in Vietnam and since co-founded the CAI, the first skills and arts therapy reintegration program for human trafficking survivors along the border regions of Vietnam. She has performed at the Na Sang Collective in Vietnam, the Mission Cultural Center in San Francisco, Links Hall, Oberlin College, Northwestern University, UMass in Boston, Prague Quadrennial, and Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile. Patricia is currently a visiting assistant professor in Asian American Studies at Northwestern University, where she received her PhD in performance studies. She is also a Paul and Daisy Soares Fellow for New Americans. So we're very excited to have both of them here to present and chat a bit. So we're going to start with William. So William, feel free to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, let me share my screen. Get all this stuff going. I'm going to put all this in a timer. I'm going to leave it like this because I want to see folks on the Zoom. But yeah, my name is William Estrada. Thank you all for being here with us. Today I'm going to be focusing on thinking about my practice as it relates to this conversation. But first, I want to think about the fact that, a lot of my practice stems from my teaching. Although I did go to school to become an artist, I really found myself most comfortable in the art education department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I worked for many years as a teaching artist. And I really found a home in the multiple arts organizations doing work in communities, but specifically at Tepochcali Elementary, where I was a teaching artist and I'm the visual arts teacher. And the reason why I really found a lot of comfort in art education and teaching was the emphasis on play and thinking about how we could use curriculum as a way to tell stories that weren't always represented, thinking about what learning looks like, what are the boundaries that we're told to follow, right, as teachers and students, who does the learning, who does the teaching, and most importantly, thinking about what are some of the things that are affecting students in their communities, right, which was the big aspect as to why I wanted to make sure that we, had these conversations with students and thinking about who's honored, who isn't, right? Like what stories are being told, what stories are not. How can we use art as a way to heal, to address race, to address racism, to address all the isms, that exist, and how can we think about contemporary art practices in this format to think about, what would it mean if we were to ask students to think of themselves as primary sources of research and knowledge creators instead of consumers of knowledge, right? Like, what would it look like if we asked students to think of themselves as authors and narrators of stories that are often overseen or are often not emphasized in education out of fear of being seen too political. And a lot of the things is really thinking about what kind of what art is emphasized, right? What kind of art making is emphasized and what kind of art is seen as being aesthetically pleasing and what other art is seen as like folk art, right? Like the hierarchy of art making, and really start to break those boundaries out. Now, as we were thinking about these places of discussions within the classroom, I really started exploring what could these discussions happen outside of our buildings, right? Out of the four walls that we call our classroom, and thinking about what would it mean for us to start thinking about, painting trees, painting sidewalks, thinking about muralists, thinking about graphic design, thinking about printmaking, and thinking about other spaces where we don't necessarily see as art spaces, and thinking about how we can change public space. And through the public space, we were also claiming public space, right? If it's a public school, if it's a public park, if it's a public sidewalk, how can we actually take ownership of it and redesign it so it actually fits the needs of the people that are working in those spaces, right? And I was really interested in thinking about, how, for myself, art education was a space where I had to relearn Spanish, because as a someone born in the late 70s, assimilation was really pushed in my public education. And my personal history and the history of Mexico was not necessarily represented in the public space, in the public education system that I went through, which was Chicago Public Schools. So really understanding, how can we weave the stories of public education, gentrification, redlining, and how can we start thinking about these complex stories through play, through making, as we see ourselves as researchers, right? And I was particularly interested in thinking about this in elementary schools, and thinking about monuments, right? Which is a big discussion right now. This was a summer program with CAPE where we actually designed monuments for the neighborhood, based on, people that we don't necessarily, that people who are seen, as dispensable at times, but are really, really icons within the neighborhood, right? And thinking about how we use art as a tool to organize and mobilize ourselves, but also to educate ourselves, right? And it was through these discussions that I started moving my work as a teacher out into the neighborhood. It first started with the idea of this family portraits project, where I would engage families in different neighborhoods in Chicago to think about, how they define family, how did they want to be represented, right? Like who got to claim ownership over neighborhoods, whose stories got to be told, who got to represent specific neighborhoods, specifically in Chicago, as we have, 77 different neighborhoods, enclaves in the city, thinking of like whose stories get to be told, who gets to be the face of those neighborhoods. And also thinking about like the archival purpose of images, right? And what the fact that having a family portrait, like you actually get to claim ownership over a space and time. Through that discussion, we started the Family Portraits Project, which was a collaboration with Anthony and Erica Brooks, where we actually created a mobile photo studio in front of the Cook County Jail on 26th in California, and started thinking about how incarceration and unjust laws are proportionally affecting Black and Brown neighborhoods, right? And what kind of stories were being untold or erased through this process, and we invited folks to really think about these conversations as far as like what incarceration and the justice system, how it affects Black and Brown communities, and what role do we play in this representation. And now we've really been moving this Family Portraits Project and the Portraits of Resolution Project out into different neighborhoods. Through these conversations, again, like these multiple projects were happening at the same time, I really started thinking about the Mobile Street. I created the Mobile Street Art Card Project, which was really meant to honor mobile vendors in Little Village, but also in the mobile vendors that I grew up in seeing and experiencing in Guadalajara. My children are a big part of my practice. Sometimes, by eager and accepting, work, and other times by forced, and through, a little bit of convincing. But really, it was a way for me to engage with discussions with people in their neighborhoods, the same discussions that I was having inside of programs, And it really ranged depending on the neighborhood and the conversations that people wanted to have. But I really started creating prompts in order to engage conversations with people. And it was really a time for me to learn and listen, you know, to the concerns and thinking about how we might be able to use art as a way to enter into spaces that might not necessarily be my own, as both as a teacher, as a community member, and as a guest, right? And how we can, you know, convince adults to play, to make, to invite folks to get to know each other, so we're no longer strangers, but also to think about ways to engage in conversations, you know, especially if those conversations aren't necessarily um, you know, where we agree with the things that people are telling us. Now, in the last 2 years, I started this radical Printshop project, and it started really because I wanted to set up printmaking in different areas, but also because winter, right? I'm not able to go out into neighborhoods during the winter, especially not in the street. So the Radical Printshop project really served as a way for me to keep engaging with different communities in different places. And it's only been in 2 places. It's been in Holman Square and the P.O. Box Collective in Rogers Park, but it's really a way for people to come together and make. And the one thing that I think that like the last 5 years has been really amazing has been the Chicago Art Collective, which is a group of, you know, beautiful individuals, both musicians, administrators, you know, artists, teachers, you know, where we're working with grassroots movements and creating graphic images to distribute for people that are doing groundwork organizing. The Mobilized Creative Collaborative, which is, there's 4 of us, right? There's the Mobile Street Art Cart, there's a Kill Charleston that does the mobile music box, and Andres Lemes Spont and Maria Spont Lemes, which again, you know, like these pedal powered, you know, stations where we're actually creating artwork out in neighborhoods. And then the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative, which is artist cooperative of like 25, 30 artists now, you know, which again makes graphics for movements, right? And those artists are from Canada, the US, and Mexico. Now, the one thing that all this has in common is that it's all about people, right? People coming together, learning from each other. And honestly, for me, you know, it's been about, you know, like really thinking about what networks look like and how we add to the multiple conversations that are already happening in their respective neighborhoods, right? So I'm gonna stop sharing there, and that is the end for me.
Great. Thanks, William. All right, Patricia, you wanna?
Yes, great. Well, before I begin, I just wanted to thank William for inviting me to be part of this panel with you. I've continued to admire your work and have the deepest respect for all that you do and how you traverse these different lines of segregation and the neighborhoods in Chicago to mobilize people in all these beautiful ways. And I also wanted to thank Joseph for coordinating in the most thoughtful ways to bring us together in conversation. And for everyone that's here, thank you for taking time out of your day. I'm gonna share my screen. I think this is how I share it. All right, great. So let's see. So the above URL, I guess, let's see if I can. So this is just my organization's website, accesslab.org. And so I'll talk about that and the work that I've done there. And then below is my own personal website where I talk about more, or you'll see my own personal practice and performance artwork, but I'll focus on the community-based work that I do. And so for now, I guess I'll leave this photo up, but I did want to talk about my trajectory into the arts and what it means to do community-based art. And so I was born and raised in Chicago. My parents are refugees from Vietnam, and I grew up with these art programs. And so as William was talking, I was like, I remember being a youth growing up in Chicago, being part of these types of work in terms of like creating murals and creative writing workshops that would be held in the public schools, like as after school programs. So it simultaneously was this place where my parents could have like a free babysitter, and then I could also like learn the arts. And so I love kind of the marriage of the two, for lack of a better word. But let's see. So yeah, so I always kind of like had this love for art because it was like this other place that I could make sense of myself and make sense of what it means to be like a person in the world, a person of color, a woman of color, like a young kid of color. And really quickly, it wasn't until I was about to go to college that I was part of a performance poetry and spoken word collective called YAP, Young Asians with Power. And so that's where I saw the way in which we could connect the arts and political practice. And I loved it because there were a lot of like weird feelings growing up as a kid, the ways that, you know, sometimes I didn't really know how to understand like my race or my class or my gender, and how I was kind of brushing up against you know, white supremacy and patriarchy in many ways, but couldn't name it as such as a child. And so being part of this like poetry, spoken word collective, it gave me more of an opportunity to not only have the tools to make sense of like histories of immigration, foreign and domestic policies in the US, but also like a place to process it, a place to make sense of it, a place to understand my own feelings in relationship to it. And so I took that and went to college and started poetry programs with young people that were formerly in juvenile detention centers, and they were also Southeast Asians. And so we did some of that work. But I'm trying to fast forward it all because I know we only have 10 minutes. But also in college, my mentor was a Black Panther. Her name is Phyllis Jackson, and she taught in art history. So I'm like, what is a former Black Panther doing teaching in art history? What is the role of art? Why does it matter? And how does it connect to like political movements? And it was there that in conversation with her, taking classes with her, that I saw that they're intimately interwoven and necessitate each other. That we did look at the work of Emory Douglas, but we also looked at the work of so many other different artists and poets and theorists, and it helped me make sense of the world in a different way. And so for me, my art practice has more recently, since high school and college and moving forward, has connected art practice and community and like political empowerment together. And so anyways, I started Access Lab, and Access Lab is a community arts organization that's based in Uptown in Chicago. And we started as a response to the urban revitalization projects or gentrification that's happening in the neighborhood. And we wanted to show that, you know, we can imagine and simultaneously manifest what it means to build the world that we want to live in with the community that has always been there. And so for folks who are not as familiar with the Argyle Street area in Uptown, it is historically since the 1970s Southeast Asian business district with a lot of restaurants and grocery stores and a pharmacy. And it's been extremely shaped by international war and public transit. And there have been different waves of immigrants and refugees that have come to the area, and it's actually known as a port of entry for a lot of immigrants and refugees. And so part of our work was trying to reclaim the street again and reclaim the stories of the people in the neighborhood. So this project doesn't get to that right away, but this project is called Sense Home. And we interviewed our parents to ask them their stories and experiences of war. And we wanted to come at it through a different route because we didn't want to think about like, okay, let's re-traumatize our parents or re-traumatize people that have been through difficult situations. Instead, we were like, what smell of food reminds you of home? And that actually opened the door for folks to talk about their experiences of like eating basil in a street food while bombs were going off in like 1968, a year before the US like started to withdraw troops. And so it was just like, it just all this started to unfold with a very simple question, activating the senses. And so we created a series of stories from these interviews and a sensorial experience for folks. So we wanted to think about like, how do you activate the senses? How do you activate the senses in relationship to memory and bringing in people who normally wouldn't talk about these stories in these ways because of their own relationship to trauma and their own relationship to violence. And so we wanted to offer different methodologies, offer different approaches. So that was one project. Another one was Access Lab also held an event on border violence and community care where we wanted to kind of bring together like art and the teach-in. And this is what it looked like, where we had mats. We actually redid, so there was, we operated underneath the Red Line Argyle train station for about a year. And we cleaned it, we scrubbed it, and then we decorated it. We had like mats that we had from Vietnam, and then we just had community gatherings there. And so we had a teach-in that talked about border violence, that talked about a history of immigration. And then we also broke people up into small groups for them to have discussions about it. But we also had screen printing, which everyone loves. And this was actually happening as a way to make posters before protests that happened the following day on border violence. And it was the Families Belong Together protests that happened. And so a lot of the work that we do is to try to respond and support local organizing efforts and larger movements that are happening, and thinking about how do we infuse art and political education together. And then also I loved what William said earlier about just taking over the street, taking back the street, and reimagining it and really putting it in the hands of the people themselves. And so Asia on Argyle, some of you might have seen this area before. This might be a new picture, but there was about $2 million that was pumped into this area to rebuild the street. And what ended up happening was it shut down the street for about a year or two, and a lot of businesses actually suffered from that. And so the street was left in kind of, desolate situations because it was an experimentation from the city to build like this shared streetscape where like bicyclists, pedestrians, and cars could share it. But when you do that, but you don't invest in the businesses and you don't invest in affordable housing for folks, it just leaves the area kind of desolate. in some ways. And so we wanted to activate it through music and performance. And so that's what we did. And then there was just a whole crowd of people that just like took over the streets. And so just thinking about what does it mean to use sound? What does it mean when bodies are kind of coming together in this way? And I know that we'll talk about COVID and how that changes everything. But these are some of the images of that. We also did this where William collaborated and was on the streets with us as well. This was an event that we had on the street to talk about the history of the area. And Uptown has a beautiful, amazing history where Black Panthers used to work with poor white Appalachians that had come through from the Great Migration during a period where there was rapid gentrification happening and Southeast Asians moving in because of resettlement in the war. So there's like all these different histories and groups moving and sharing space. So that's a print that was made, and that's a Chicago torture, a John Burge torture survivor that is now one of the most amazing advocates for justice in the city of Chicago. These are some other prints that we had, and it was a really beautiful way to reuse the train station. And then most recently, this is a series of events that we have called Food Not Cops. And this will be our fourth one, which will be taking place tomorrow. And so I just came from assembling COVID care kits and food kits. And so my head was in a different place a little bit. But we named it Food Not Cops because initially it was a response to how Mayor Lightfoot took away free meals from Chicago public school students. And for a lot of students, that's like their only meal of the day. But then she reinstated the free meals for students only with the presence of the Chicago Police Department in the schools themselves. And we were like, no. Food Not Cops, kind of a play on Food Not Bombs, and thinking about the militarization and hyper-policing of folks in these communities. And so, yeah, it's been an amazing experience being on the street and seeing how folks are interacting with each other. Even though, it's known as a Southeast Asian business district, there are a lot of Black and Latinx folks that live in the neighborhood that don't get the same amount of attention or care. And so this work that we do becomes this site of encounter for a lot of folks, which is really exciting. And so really quickly, we're stationed on the corner of Winthrop and Argyle, and on the left is the Roots of Argyle mural, and the store that we're in front of is an Asian grocery store that's been around for a few decades that closed because of COVID and the impending CTA renovation projects that made them feel like they couldn't survive any longer. And so, yeah, that's it. And that's my daddy. Oh, and maybe I should mention, so this is intergenerational work. So my father has been a community organizer in the neighborhood for almost 40 years. And so the relationships that we have with the businesses and the local residents is decades in the making. And so I really think about what does it mean to practice in a very site-specific way? What does it mean to build relationships over a long period of time within a specific geographic location? And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So great to see those images of just how much work you both have done over the years. And frankly, it's just really nice to see a bunch of people hanging out together. Like almost imagine a different world. But really, it's just so interesting to see the different directions your work has taken, but also the overlap. And we've talked a couple times over the past couple of weeks. So I'm just gonna jump right into kind of like, the elephant in the room topic. Well, I guess there's several elephants in the room. But one of the main things that, we wanted to discuss today is, the complications of transferring the type of work both of you are engaged in very deeply in communities, and transferring that work in our current context. So yeah, I guess that's my first prompt to you. How are you thinking about transferring this community situated work to online spaces, and or negotiated outdoor spaces or public spaces?
Um, Patricia and I have been having many conversations over the last month and a half, 2 months. And I've had these conversations with you as well. Just I personally balance not only with my actual teaching inside a classroom and spaces, but also like my practice as an artist, right? Like it's all based out in the street, right? So I've been having a really hard time trying to figure out what is safe and what isn't. Also, in full transparency, like my partner, my wife is a nurse, right? And our risk tolerance is very different. Where I'm just like, oh, I'm ready. I'm like ready to go out and see what happens. She's definitely like, you may be ready, but you share a space, with me and our children, and what are the real risk factors, right, of these interactions, especially with, specifically with art cart. Obviously there's shared materials, there's a shared collective experience of like making, and although people take what they make home, like the squeegees, the screens, the Sharpies, we're making buttons, the button machine, things like that, like everyone is touching, so figuring out like what is the safest way to do this. And it's depending on the day that you catch me. Today I'm just like, I think I could do it. Yesterday when we had a talk, I was like, I cannot do it. So depending on the day of the week and what is happening out in our world, it's been really hard emotionally, psychologically, and and obviously like wanting that, right? Like I teach and I make this because I really enjoy being with other people. I want to have those conversations with people. I want to, be out in different neighborhoods. And the fact that I can't do that right now is really, is hard. So, but we're trying to figure out like what is a balance.
Yeah, absolutely. These conversations we've had, we're like troubleshooting in different ways, and we've thought about like different shared surfaces, different shared like art supplies and utensils, like all of that. And so Access Lab went out on the streets about 4 weeks ago, and I it's allergy season, and every time I sneeze or every time I'm like, oh, I'm scared. Like, I want to preface that, it's some of the risks that I have to think about when going on the street, is like making sure that I'm not a carrier, and that I'm not spreading it in any way. And so it's been thinking about like, how do I, if I'm going to do this work on the street, make sure that I'm tested regularly, and seeing where the testing sites are available, and also making those testing sites information or the testing site information available for the volunteers that I'm working with too, because I want to make sure to prioritize health and safety and the well-being of folks that we're working with. But so far, being out on the street has been really wonderful, has been so amazing. And we just set up these big tents on this like open street. We don't really measure, but we can kind of feel like arm's distance in some way to allow for social distancing. But most people wear masks, and some people that don't have masks, we hand it out to them. We also have hand sanitizer on the table. I know it's not like 100% effective, but it offers some kind of protective measures. And there's something about being on the street consistently and people recognizing you more and more every time, and that offering room for relationship building, for trust building, and for folks to reveal like their own stories and what they've been going through. Like last week, and so part of it is like, how is this art? How is food distribution art? How is a COVID care kit art, right? I think about it in terms of through the lens of performance, you know, and the way that we think about relationship and how we're thinking about different, also how do we think about care and like acts of care and different things like that, and ways of building community on the street. But we will actually add other elements that are specifically like visual arts and storytelling art. But it's, for example, we had like Epsom salt, like bath salts that we had for people in one of the COVID care kits. And at first I was like, oh, that's, that's bougie. Like, like, is that on the hierarchy of needs? Do people really need bath salts? You know what I'm saying? And so it was so amazing because everybody proved me wrong. They were just like, I was like, oh, these bath salts you can use and it helps soothes like your aches and pains. And they were just like, people were just telling me about their bodily aches and pains. And a lot of these folks are like, poor working class, folks of color on the street. And I was like, wow, people were talking about their joints, their knees, their back, their neck. And I was just like, wow, like this is beautiful. What does it mean to then provide more forms of care while we're on the street? And so that made me think about like a different project that William and I will be collaborating on, and other prompts that we can create for the members of the community. And so troubleshooting that now is like, if people are going to fill something out, do I just give them the pencil, or like, do we wipe down the pencil? What do we do with that? For now, I'm not moving the work that I do online because a lot of the people that I work with in the Argyle community are like elders. And at this point, before we worked with a younger population of people that had more access to the internet, but here we see that it's most effective to be on the street, located where folks are. But we're also like archiving, so it's like this weird thing where we're doing a lot of direct work on the street and thinking about a potential story booth that we want to create, because we're doing an archival project of the history of the area and wanting people to share their stories and their lived experiences. And so it will be living as an archive online. But we think about, how does that archive become activated on the street?
Yeah, I think, hearing both of you, there's, this kind of risk benefit analysis you have to do. And William, you both kind of alluded to that in different ways, and there is, like you said, like bringing up, oh, this is something that cures aches and pains. And then suddenly people wanted to get that out and talk about it and share. So it makes me think of like, kind of the need for this work in the world in general. And in how you have to kind of balance, okay, well, am I putting people at risk by doing these kinds of things, or am I at risk as an artist in this current context? But you know, and I'm gonna like pivot a little bit to the other elephant in the room, which is, you know, just the massive turnout and protest in reaction to George Floyd's murder. And you know, that's another situation, you know, after decades or more of years of oppressive state of police brutality, you know, there was just an outpouring of need to physically protest, you know, like an online petition was not going to cut it this time, you know, and people felt the need to take that risk. And so I wonder about, you know, like your practices respectively, you know, like what is the impetus right now with that context as well in mind?
I can go. So before, when we were working, Access Lab was working on Argyle Street. As we see, like in a lot of neighborhoods are being developed, right? In ways that lead to forced displacement of a lot of residents that are folks of color, working class. What comes alongside that is increased police presence as a way to clean up the neighborhood, as a way to kind of stop the like solicitation or whatever that, or loitering, right, that happens, or how they define loitering. And so a way that we were trying to combat that before, about 5 years ago, was thinking about how we can connect with business owners who are mostly immigrants and refugees. And the way that we did that was we worked with their, I know this is about present day, and so we're trying to try to kind of connect it, but really at the crux of it is I want to think about how do we tackle anti-Blackness in Southeast Asian immigrant and refugee communities, specifically on this block, right? And so if business owners are conditioned in a particular way to call police and are encouraged to by local government officials to clean up the block, you know, quote unquote, then who does that disproportionately target? That disproportionately targets the Black and Latinx folks that live in the area. And so the way that we were trying to intervene on that in more subtle ways with folks that have their own relationship to state power, state violence, war, and government, is to just interview them. We ask their stories, and it sounds weird, but we co-curated like a menu with them, and we were just like, tell us about the region that you came from. And then through those conversations, we were actually able to ask them how they envision the neighborhood that they're working in, and how they understand ideas of safety, and how they understand like the role of police. And that's when we would begin to educate folks together in conversation about the presence of police and in relationship to race and violence. And so now, yesterday we had a conversation, and William said something really, really important, which was like, what does it mean to name this work, right? And specifically name what we're doing. And so the way that we've transitioned is to just call it out explicitly in this way that is not about calling people out, but calling them in, but calling out like how we're naming the anti-Blackness that is embedded in our communities, and what does it mean to really address that through difficult conversations, through different forms of art practices that bring people in, and open conversations and open ways of dialogue that might be a little bit messy. And so those are the ways in which we've tried to address it, and also to address the problem of police violence, the problem of the over-militarization and the overfunding of police that actually takes away resources for housing, for education, for basic social services, mental health clinics, also simultaneously criminalizes, over-criminalizes Black and brown police. And so at our events, we have stickers that we give away. That's like, there's this hashtag 8 to Abolition campaign. So we talk about, we have like political zines that are just like 101, what is abolition? How do we understanding police? How do we understand like the role of police in our public schools? And so people pick up this literature and pick up some free food and pick up a sticker. And then we also get to talk to each other on the street. And so that's how we're trying to address it right now and align the efforts with the larger Black-led organizations that are Black-led and the movement for Black lives that have called for the defunding of police.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for me, the collaboration aspect of the work that I do is what, like, I've been shifting now that I can't be necessarily out in different streets and different neighborhoods. It's really thinking about who's like who is doing the work outside, right? Like who is actually organizing, and how can I assist through like graphics and you know, amplifying that work already. I think for me, I grew up in, you know, predominantly Black neighborhoods, and went to predominantly Black public schools, you know, so there was always this sense of you know, the Black struggle, right? Like I was not taught Mexican history or Mexican culture in public schools, right? So my connection to the civil rights movement was the one thing that that politicized me, right? Before I even knew what that meant. You know, and there was also a lot of discussion on, you know, family members, you know, with friends, you know, on anti-Blackness, right? Which again, you know, like those conversations are happening right now, right? Like they were happening, you know, a couple of weeks ago. And it was something that I was constantly unlearning. And I always, like, a lot of the work that I do, I frame around my own personal experiences, because I think it allows folks, you know, my vulnerability, you know, the criminalization of my body as a brown male, you know, cis male, like trying to work on a corner, right? Like thinking about like, what does it mean, right? Like for me to be trying to hustle, you know, on a corner, right? Like trying to talk to women, trying to talk to men, you know, trying to talk to children, right? Like, what does it mean for me to engage in these conversations? What is a relationship, you know, that is allowed, that is acceptable or unacceptable, you know, because of how I look, you know? And thinking about these relationships of like, what places am I allowed to be in, to exist in, right? Like what places is my body allowed to be in? And then what other places are dangerous, right? Both for me as a you know, male, but then also like for the people that are around me, right? And I think a lot of my work challenges these notions of like public space and our bodies, and who's allowed to talk to who. And I think, you know, with the projects themselves, you know, I've been focusing on specifically on the borders of like North Lawndale, which is predominantly, you know, Black community, and Little Village, right? Which is a predominantly, you know, Mexican, you know, community, right? And it's South Lawndale and North Lawndale, right? But it's still Lawndale, right? Like it's one community that was actually split. And the fact that, you know, for me growing up in Chicago, I constantly grew up, you know, like I felt, you know, with the history of redlining, you know, in the nation, you know, that Mexican neighborhoods were constantly the borders, you know, or the buffer zones between like white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. And we were constantly being used through this colonial mindset of, you know, you want to achieve whiteness, right? Like we want to achieve the American dream by assimilating, by losing your language, right? By making others feel more comfortable. And so by doing that, they were also pitting us against, Black communities, right? Because then it's like, well, why are Black communities getting this when we need it too? Instead of thinking, how do we need to work together so we can make sure that both communities are, and I think in conversations now around abolishing police departments, like really thinking about how can we generate, right, like this funds, like the funds exist in every single city across this nation, but it's really thinking about if we were to ask the most vulnerable communities what they need, right, like we could come up with 1,000 ways to spend that money, right? And I think the art making, that both Patricia and I do, like helps us kind of reimagine those conversations, and allows people to think, right, about what it is that they want through this playfulness, right? Because I think as adults, I'm an elementary art teacher, right? But a lot of the work that I do with adults is really about reminding them to play and to use your imagination, right? Because like that's literally the most dangerous tool, right? Because if we're thinking about imagining new spaces and reimagining the spaces that we have now to make sure that it actually fits the needs of the people that are living it and working it, right? That's very dangerous. That's very dangerous for a lot of people, right? Because then I'm not thinking just about me, I'm thinking about everyone else around me, and I think this playfulness and the reimagining, through button making, through screen printing, through stickers, through food, through through salts, Epsom salts, it allows us to create the spaces of like, well, why aren't we allowed this space? Why aren't we allowed to have these conversations with others? And I think I use art as this moment to disrupt like our everyday, right? And also a moment to reclaim like these public spaces and these public conversations about what our community needs. And I think, for in this time right now, like I've been, I started creating these Arte with Maestro William videos on YouTube, to start engaging these discussions. And again, like they were really meant for the students that I work with, but they're also dealing with a lot of, more complex concepts of, race, right? And representation, whose stories are being told, what narratives are being told, right? How do we wield power, right? Like if I have power, am I not gonna say, well, I have power, so I'm gonna oppress everyone else because that's how I learned about power? Or am I gonna take power and be like, well, now I'm gonna, make sure that I distribute power to the most vulnerable, and ask, right? Like collaborate to figure out what kind of systems, what kind of structures we need to create for ourselves, and I think the art making and the imagination piece to all the work that we do allows us, gives us permission to be vulnerable, right? To make mistakes, to play in a way that adults are usually, told that they can't because then it's not professional, right? Like you cannot project your feelings because feeling is not professional, right? We are not allowed to show up with our whole selves, right? Like we're told to compartmentalize, and be like, your home is here, work is here, the nation is over there, right? Like you can only do this, and we can't, right? Like we need to allow ourselves to show up with our whole selves and address the complexities, and I think for me too as well, like the reason why I oppose these systems, policing is like, because the reality is that, if there would have been police in my high school, I would not be speaking with you right here, right? Like I would be incarcerated, right? And like, I don't know, I would much rather do this work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making me think about just like how this moment too, it's like with the elephants in the room, of COVID and the current protest movement, that there's actually these, oh shoot, did I freeze? Am I back? Okay. Opportunities for embracing the uncertainty of the moment. Scott, wrote a blog article in our newsletter recently about thinking about how in this uncertainty in the moment, there is kind of an opportunity. And you mentioned the Arte with Maestro William as kind of an experimental ground for you right now in your practice. So I'm curious, from both of you, like how you're reimagining this moment, and how it, like going forward, what are things that you're questioning about your own practice and that you're looking at and thinking of, what new things are possible for you going forward.
I can go. um, so I think about uncertainty a lot. There's this Buddhist philosophy of impermanence, and I grew up culturally Buddhist, so going to temple and all of that. But sometimes the sermons weren't all that, and so my dad let me go play in the playground. So so just learning to discern for myself what's useful, what's not, and already critiquing institutions there. So for me, like growing up poor, working class, like a child of refugees, uncertainty was always like a reality of life in different ways, that nothing was ever really promised. And it was learning about how to live through like precarious situations in different ways. And that prepared me to trust, or to learn how to cultivate what it means to trust my gut, to improvise, what it means to deeply listen to others and to feel the pulse and the vibe and the energy of the room and the space and people. And part of that is like just a deep presence. Like, what does it mean to really wait for a second and just like sit with what needs to be done? A lot of the times when like we see with the protests, right? And all that was happening, it's a rupture in the normalization of what happens day to day. And so then there's a lot of folks who are activated, some for the first time, some are activated in different ways because they've been doing this work for decades. But the sense of urgency like jolts us in many ways. And sometimes that jolting is, it's necessary and good, right? Because it allows action to take place. But how do we hone it in a way where we don't burn out? Because sometimes in situations of uncertainty, we want control, right? We want to know, we want to grasp, we want some sense of assurance. But what does it mean to work in the place of the unknown? What does it mean to hone a sense of letting go, being present and trusting yourself and trusting the people that you've cultivated strong relationships with? And I think this goes back to what William was saying with what it means to play, right? What it means to experiment, what it means to imagine. That as children, we've cultivated those tools, right? Of like, let's experiment, let's not know, let me jump off this thing and see how, if I land, right? And that's what abolition is, in many ways, where it's like, it seems like a big unknown, but there are pockets of moments that show us that different realities can actually take place in the world that we already live in. So how do we hone that, and how do we listen to that? And so for me, uncertainty has, I've learned how to take uncertainty because of my parents, and because of them being refugees, and because of how I grew up. And you know, with limited resources, you learn how to be a little bit more creative with what you got, you know, because also sometimes, you know, when you want to create stuff and you have anything is possible, it's really overwhelming. And so actually when you work within limitations at times, you can actually deepen what's possible. And so questions of my own practice, I think what I'm trying to figure out is how to be more how to be more sustainable financially, because a lot of this work is self-funded, and a lot of it is because it's a passion project. And so now it's figuring out, like, how do I make sure to fund it in a way that like sustains the people that I'm working with, allows me to like have the material that I need to be able to do this kind of work. But you know, my dad worked in nonprofit, so I understand the strings that are attached with grants, the rubrics that are required to evaluate how much impact that you've made. And the biggest question that I've always been asked is, how do you measure the impact of your art practice and community? It's like, you feel it, you just feel it, you know? And so, so I think it's like kind of grappling with that. And those relationships and connections that are made without like giving over to funding institutions and philanthropic like metrics of what progress, development, impact is.
Yeah, that's very well put. William, I want you to respond too, but I just realized, also, folks, if you have any questions or statements you want to share in the chat, please do so. Before we go, there's lots of lovely comments already. But if you want to bring up something that we're not bringing up, please do. Yeah, again, Patricia, very well put. I think it's, you know, as you, like, limits are good in terms of artistic constraints, but not in terms of making an art practice that's just about complying with a funder. Yeah, and that's, I think, critical right now, is to imagine things that actually go outside of that kind of like quantitative or like consumerist capitalist view of things. This is actually a moment where we can think around and outside of that. So I'm excited by the way how you put that. William, do you have any response, like kind of future projections, imaginings that you'd like to share at all?
I mean, I think, I mean, right now I'm definitely like, I have tons of time, right, that I didn't have before, because I can't go anywhere, you know? So like really thinking about projects that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and you know, writing them, actually planning with on a larger space, right? And thinking about like what those collaborations can look like, you know? But yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, you know, yeah, how do we make this work sustainable? You know, like I was trying to figure out what I could do with a mobile street art card, and thinking about like screen printing on masks, right, and giving them away in the neighborhoods, but also trying to figure out like how do I pay for those masks, right? How do I pay for um, antibacterial, wipes and things, like to make sure that folks are safe, But I think part of it is like we're always, as teachers and artists, like we're always trying to figure all this stuff out, like how can we serve 100 kids with $20, which sucks, right? Like I think, we should really think if anyone does, foundation work, like really thinking about, how can we make sure that teachers and artists have equitable funds, to do projects out in neighborhoods and and rethinking about those pieces, right? Because unfortunately, we're a little too comfortable with constraints. Like we're able to work with them, but it would be really nice to have the actual resources to make these projects on a wider scale.
Awesome. Towards the middle of what you're saying, I got booted because of my internet, but it erased my chat. So I don't know if I missed any questions. Did I? No. Okay. Okay. No worries. Just want to check. So I have a question for you two, which I'm just curious. And if you don't have something in mind, it's okay. But at one point, William, you brought up this thing about, in this kind of work in communities and in schools, you are you're figuring out how to learn and listen through art making. And I just wondered about like if you had any stories related to that, like moments where really being a listener working in a community context really impacted that project in specific, or maybe your work going forward, like any moment where like listening was a key ingredient to the development of art making.
I mean, I think, specifically with like the Portraits of Resolution project, when I was in front of the Cook County Jail, one of the things that we were going to do was record people's stories, right? Like how incarceration or, the justice system had impacted them directly. And the first, like literally within the first like 30, 40 minutes, that we had set up the photo studio, we, both Anthony, Eric, and I like decided that we were not going to record any of the stories because there was so much vulnerability. Like people just wanted to listen, right? Like people want someone to listen to them, without any judgment, and I think that's happened across, most of the projects that I've done out on the street, right? Like there's this constant conversation of folks, wanting to know more about like why are we doing this work for free, right? Like what's the catch, and this unlearning that we're all doing together as we're making, and thinking about the fact that, we're there to share space, and however much people want to share or however little they want to share, both of those are okay, right? But for the most part, Joseph, like there's been multiple times where, again, like there was a family that like told us their whole story, about incarceration and how, the justice system had really affected their family, and how I had gone through multiple generations. There was another time on 26th Street through the mobile street art cart where someone, I was doing like sugar skulls, in October, November, and someone made a sugar skull and like started crying, and I was like, are like, what's going on? Like, are you okay? And they're like, you just have no idea. Like I was having such a bad week, and I didn't realize how much I needed this time to just make something, and he's like, and just like seeing you interact with people, like people are talking to me, like I know none of us know each other, but everyone's so nice, and man, I just like started bawling. I'm like an emotional being, like I just started crying, and was like, well, no, like this is part of it's part of the work, right? Like of creating in spaces, you know. But I think it's those connections, right? That folks, you know, we forget, right? Like we forget that we need that time and space to just be, right? And to then also interact with others. And I think especially, you know, now that we've, you know, been apart from a lot of people for the last couple of months, like those feelings are going to be intensified once we are out again, right? It's like I think our work was important as artists working in communities, you know, but I think now is even going to be, you know, more exponentially, you know, like vibrant and needed, right? To like think about like how we're using art as healing, as creating a space for us to share our stories, our experiences. Wow.
Great. Patricia, did you have anything you wanted to respond to that too?
Yeah, I deeply appreciated what you shared because it's been moments of similar experience doing this Food Not Cops event on the street where people are just sharing like how their day is, what it means to feel seen, to feel heard, to have a space that, you know, they feel cared for, to process in some way. And you know, there was a comment earlier about the bath salts too, and then just thinking about like needs and luxury and pleasure, right? And so like art becomes one of the first things that are like funding for the arts is one of the first things that's cut because it's seen as luxury in some way, right? And so it's just and it's just making me think about like how are we defining like the hierarchy of needs, right? How are we thinking about like if we are calling for the defunding of police and there are millions of dollars to be released to the public again, right? Where can it go? How can it go to the arts? To because what does it mean that like something that is seen as free is like a gimmick is attached to it, right? Like that's what capitalism does to our minds, that it's that anything that's free is attached to like an advertisement for something, or it's attached to like consumer culture in a particular kind of way versus like actually free programming. Things should be free, basic things should be free, like art, education, you know, healthcare, right? These basic things when we're talking about people feeling pain, like what is their access to proper health care and health services? And so just going back to Joseph's question about what does it mean to listen, I think that it's such a fundamental part of our practice, and a fundamental part of what it means to work in community. And yesterday we were talking a little bit about like what it means to also be an educator and come from a teaching background, and how that informs like a community art practice. And so like as a teacher in the classroom, as a community educator, you know, as a professor, um, you know, I see that role more of a facilitator, and versus like a lecturer, because I kind of draw from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and instead of the banking method of education where it's like dumping all of the knowledge into this blank canvas that is a student, is actually dialectical and dialogical, and it is about co-producing the knowledge together and like cultivating that. What does it mean to be wrong, to not know, to figure it out with somebody else? And I think that deep listening is fundamental to making that process possible, to feeling the pulse of the room, to gauging where people are emotionally, and how to and where to take that conversation, right? Because sometimes when people are being vulnerable, sometimes it's just about listening, like there, or sometimes they want more questions, you know, or sometimes folks might want an affirming response in a different way. And so how do we navigate that? And how does like different forms of art become this mediating tool? Like when you're screen printing, like literal physical movement, right? When you're in a drum circle and you feel your own heartbeat and you're in like a group of people, when you see dancers moving, like how does that activate you viscerally and in your body? I think about all these different artistic practices and how they call us to be present in our own bodies and with each other in a different way of listening.
I think, Patricia, I wanted to add, I think especially right now, right, when there's so many things changing, there's so many things happening that for generations we were told couldn't happen, right? It's this moment to continue pushing, right? And there's also this notion of like, why are we afraid of that change, right? Like, what is it about the systems that we're demanding change of? Like, what if they change? Like, why are we afraid, and how does that affect us, right? Like, what our own internal trauma that we've experienced, right, that brings those changes into focus, that then asks us to be like, no, like, we need that. Why do we need it, right? And I think it's one of those notions where we have to continually push, right? And I'm constantly reminded, right, like during monarchies, right, like no one could ever imagine living without a king, right? And I think all these systems, right, like we tend to honor, at least I know, like I use this with Mexican culture, right? Like we honor, Pancho Villa, and Zapata, but they were called terrorists, right? Like they were called, you know, a different amount of names, right? Because of the fact that they were, challenging the systems that were in power, and people were afraid, right? And I think it's one of those questions that I think right now, as artists, as teachers, we're constantly being, asked and tasked with, right? Like we're either going to maintain the status quo and teach what we're told to teach because it shouldn't be political, which I don't believe so, right? Because our work, our bodies are politicized every single day, right? Or we are gonna teach. Yeah, booted. I got kicked out for a little bit there. Or we're going to, as artists as well, right? Like we're constantly going to push and ask to think critically as to why these systems exist, right? Why are these laws in place? Who do these laws protect? Do they really protect me, right? And I think it's part of the work that that I'm personally interested in doing, and the work that we do as artists and teachers, to think about, like, again, why are the arts cut? Like, who decided what academic pieces are important? Like, someone had to make a decision, right? And it's time for us to like really question those systems, right? Like, who are these systems meant to serve, right? Are they really serving the student, or are they serving a corporation, right? Or I'm gonna stop there.
So in the final moments here, there's so many positive comments coming, so I hope that everybody's reading them as they come and just kind of reflections. But I did notice there's one question. So this one says, I want to get to it before we get off. Along this line of transforming practice through listening and public participation, do you feel your practice is no longer your own and starts to belong to the community you're working with? So you want to...
Do you want to go first,
Yeah,
William?
I mean, yeah, definitely. You know, I think one thing that I've learned is that I can go in with an idea, but that idea is going to quickly change, right? Once I start working with others. And I think, you know, that's why I base my art practice around teaching. Because as a teacher, like, you know that, right? Like, you can go in there and be like, I'm going to teach these students this thing, and students will tell you whether they really want to learn that or not, you know? And I think very much like community work, you know, you can kind of go in with an idea, but that idea, you have to be flexible and willing to change that.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I also have my own practice of performance art. And I try to reconcile the two in some ways, but sometimes it's sometimes I see my work and I take from the lineage of Black feminists and women of color, like poets and artists, of what it means to like be a conduit, to be a conjurer. That a lot of this work, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to us. And when we co-create it in this way, how do we redefine like individualist notions, but also how do we not lose ground with where we are ourselves and what we also need alongside that. And so my personal practice becomes an incubator for how I'm processing and thinking through these ideas, but the community work, it demands a different methodology, a different sense of presence. But I guess my own personal practice is different, and it's about conjuring memory in another way that is about historical like people and honoring those that are disappeared and those that have passed. And so it seems individual, but it is also not, because it is in connection with spirit in a different way. But not that the community work is also not, it's like that necessitates spirit too.
Yeah, that's great. I like that image of conjuring. Actually, in both kinds of work, it's really interesting to think of that idea of, you know, working in communities as a form of conjuring, you know, but also for an individual practice. I can see that as well, totally. So we're kind of at time, and I'm glad we did a longer time. First, we were talking about doing an hour, but I'm glad we did an hour and a half, because this is really wonderful to hear you guys stretch out your ideas a bit. Quickly, I'm seeing some other posts here. Someone asked if the recording will be posted on the CAPE site. I think so, or maybe a transcription, or both.
We
There'll
might put
be
the,
some follow-up.
the Cape Network Forum site.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
we'll
put it on the Cape Network Forum site.
yeah. This will be, I'll send a follow-up email to all the attendees that will include maybe even a little questionnaire, but definitely some resources, including the Cape Chicago.tumblr.com. And just wonderful praise. Laura asked a question that maybe we could follow up afterwards. So I'll get that to you, Willem and Patricia. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Oh yeah, Scott just posted the Tumblr site if you want to see a link to other ongoing things developing, but we'll definitely post things about this event there as well. Thank you all so much. This was just really inspiring and inspired, and we're very lucky to have you, William, and Patricia today, and everybody who came out. It's really really grateful to have this space to have this conversation. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye. Ciao.